Everyone, welcome to Mind Matter Podcasts. Here we attempt to facilitate productive discussions of recent topics with top professionals in their corresponding fields. Just a disclaimer, the views expressed and discussed within this episode does not necessarily reflect or represent the true views and thoughts of the moderator or the associated university. This is to ensure the facilitation of a broad and varied discussion. Here we have Mr. William A. Cohn, who is a seasoned lawyer and has practiced law since 1993. Being an amicus curiae in an international court in Hague is only one of his many prestigious achievements. He has published in many different areas with impactful articles regarding ethics and law, and he is a fierce advocate of freedom of speech. Furthermore, he has lectured on these topics in universities such as State University of New York University, and University of New York in Prague. Both our moderators today are prior students of his class, Reason and Argument at the University of New York in Prague. So we will be starting with the topic of confirmation bias. Now, since none of the core economies were formed after the invention of internet, do you think should freedom of speech online be restricted to control the filter bubble effect that is commonly forming extremist opinions these days?
Well, there's a whole lot to unpack in that question, but if I may exercise my own freedom of speech, I'd like to begin by thanking you, Naveen and Frederiki. Did I finally learn how to say your name properly? Friederike.
That's it, yeah.
Yeah, right. I had it down at the end of our class, but it's been a while. For organizing this, it's wonderful initiative of yours. Good for you.
Thank you.
And in your introduction, you characterized me as a fierce free speech advocate, and you will see as we get into the question that you just asked and other things that I'm not certain that's an apt description, because I find the questions attending to free speech to be vexing and provocative, and I constantly find myself rethinking and questioning my presumptions. So I guess when it comes to that description, I fall back on the adage, better the devil I know than the devil I don't know. Free speech as we know it, with all its presumptions and against content-based restrictions on speech, is what I believe in until there's something better. But no doubt, as your question suggests, technology has created all sorts of new challenges that were unanticipated by the people who have developed free speech jurisprudence. So your question is, does confirmation bias and filtering technologies force us to rethink free speech fundamentalism? And I think it should force us to seriously question the assumptions of free speech fundamentalism. So let's begin with the problem, and I'll point to a solution that one of my students actually suggested, which I think is a good one.
From UNIT?
So it's like, the problem is that First Amendment jurisprudence was developed in a situation, I don't know, should I be looking at you or should I be looking at the camera? Or mix it up a little bit, right? Yeah, I find it strange to look at a piece of equipment when I can look at human beings, but I'll try to pretend that you're a human being. Maybe you could put like some ears on it or a hat or something. Hello, people. See, the problem is that free speech jurisprudence developed around the presumption and in fact the reality at the time of a scarcity of speech. And that the whole purpose of the marketplace of ideas presumption that we want to enable anybody who wants to speak and be heard is that there was a shortage of perspectives that people could learn from to get information and ideas to come up with the optimal solutions. Absolutely. So like Justice Holmes in the 1990 case of Abrams versus US in his dissent first articulates this notion of a marketplace of ideas, and the idea is that more speech is always better than less, because the only way for people to be able to discern the truth is by having unrestricted access to the whole range of perspectives and ideas out there in order to be able to use their rational, well-intentioned minds to figure out what's true and what's not.
Would you mind if I cut you off there?
Say what?
Would you mind if I cut you off there?
No, please do, but I've only begun to answer your question.
Sure. From a diverse viewpoint opinion, the higher likelihood of professors...
Can I just conclude the thought before you...
Sure.
Okay, the problem clearly now is that there is not a shortage of speech. There's an abundance of speech. We're no longer dealing with a scarcity of speech. We're dealing with an overwhelming mass of speech that has minimal, if any, truth value in often cases, and is what's been called weaponized speech in order to confuse and distort. And so filtering technology is the proposal that my student Jonathan Bujak suggested in his term paper from my philosophy of law class, is to impose a filter tax upon companies that profit from providing filtered information, which abets the information cocoons that create the problems with the dysfunctional human mind and society at large.
I understand. But my point was, the higher likelihood of professors leaning towards the left, according to the Heterodox Academy, as we have it here, the link will be in the description, is 14-1 in the US universities. And do you think this is a good ratio for a balanced viewpoint atmosphere? And to make both sides of the argument educated, is it fair that this filter called education sifts out a majority left-leaning crowd?
There's a real problem about political correctness, and I feel stymied by political correctness because it's like, you remember from our class that it's not about what to think, it's about how to think. It's like, I don't care what you think, I just want to know the basis of your beliefs and how well you can respond to objections and provide evidence in support of your views and recognize the legitimacy of opposing views. So it's like, but then again, what's your baseline? What's your threshold when you say that it's 14-1 left-leaning, right? It's like kind of conventional orthodoxy that, yes, institutions of higher education are left-leaning, but it's like within the spectrum of political voices, left-leaning from the centrist paradigm. So it's like I'm ill-prepared to accept the notion that there's an institutional bias in higher education. It gets branded that way by the conventional orthodoxy of the society at large, whose spectrum of viewpoints I think is rather limited. So does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
To pick up on that though, so you've mentioned before that before, when there was basically the freedom of speech law was invented, basically, you
when was speech invented?
I mean, not invented.
Am I allowed to turn questions back on you?
Well, I mean, yes, of course. But, okay, so my point is basically, you said earlier that there was a shortage of viewpoints before, and now there's a plethora of people who are speaking out about their various viewpoints. But the data that we've just presented to you kind of suggests that this isn't necessarily true, because we have a lot more polarization, a lot more people who are left-leaning, according to this.
Speaking of polarization, you'll notice that your colleague's question frames something in a polarized way.
Correct.
As there being two sides to every story. Come on now, didn't you learn anything?
I see.
I mean, you're completely correct, but do you think then that is actually still true, even in the age of the internet, that there is a plethora of viewpoints, or that it really is just polarizing towards two different ways or two different viewpoints?
I think that the internet's gotten hijacked by commercial forces. I think that the monetization of every web click through the genius of Google has completely transformed the potential of the World Wide Web to be a place for the widest possible dissemination of the spectrum of information and ideas, because there's a commercial incentive attached to every minute that everybody spends online.
Right.
That's the construct of it now. And I don't know that you can reverse that. Mm-hmm. All you can do is recognize it and remedy it perhaps through a filter tax and other suggestions that have been made. I think I shared with your class Columbia Law Professor Tim Wu's article, How Twitter Killed the First Amendment, and the longer paper that grew out of, which was a paper that he wrote for the Knight Ridder Institute called "Emerging Threats to the First Emerging Threats is the First Amendment Obsolete?" And in that, he goes through a whole series of legal proposals that might help to remedy it. But I mean, let's be honest. At the end of the day, the law can't catch up to the technology unless we're prepared to do something to say that the internet is a public resource and a public utility, which gives us power to regulate it and decommercialize it. Then essentially what you're doing is swimming upstream. You're kind of taking all these extraordinary efforts to do that, which is seemingly impossible, which is to correct the imbalances to what's happened to the web. So.
Well, do you then really think that a filter tax would sincerely stop that? Would a filter tax really weed out the people that are trying to filter information?
Yeah, well, I don't know, but I mean, all you can do, if you're not gonna say that the net is a utility which we need to place limits on its commercialization, then all you can do is to use the law as a nudge, as Cass Sunstein calls it, in order to provide incentives for companies to act in ways that have less negative externalities to society. And I think there's no doubt when you look at like the nature of political discourse today and what's happening in elections that there are all sorts of spillover costs from their business model. And I don't blame Silicon Valley for their genius in doing what they do. They're doing what they're supposed to do. It's the job of government to say how business can and cannot earn money, and if they're doing things that impose a social cost, try to do that. So the filter tax would be one way of addressing that. And then there's stuff about broadening the notion of state action, because of course, like historically it was seen as government that censored, right? But government's not the main censor anymore. So in that sense, the First Amendment and free speech jurisprudence is clearly antiquated, because what you're dealing with is private actors with a some often murky relationship with the state, so we don't really know what's happening behind the scenes in terms of their, working together in terms of the sort of speech that comes out. But there's no doubt when you live in a when you live in a world where money controls politics, that these things all become a little bit interrelated and difficult to disentangle. So, I mean, I would refer to the net neutrality debate as an example, okay? I mean, net neutrality is obviously a thing that a lot of young people care a lot about. And we can recognize that, that one of the things that Tim Wu talks about in his paper is the weaponized speech. It's the old Soviet Chinese model of censorship where you drown out dissenting voices and you mobilize armies in order to make them seem like weirdos, right? The net neutrality debate in the U.S. Congress was greatly influenced, apparently. And one of the things we need to be really humble about in the age of new media, and even before, but more so now, is to know how hard it is to know what's really true. You read a news story, it's really hard to figure out what has real truth value in that. What is noise, what is spin, what is regurgitated information, because lies spread like wildfire on the internet, and a lie told often enough becomes the truth, so on and so forth. So apparently, according to Tim Wu's paper, the whole net neutrality debate was greatly influenced by the use of bots in order to create mechanized means of pretending to be human beings speaking in order to say we want net neutrality weakened because it's hurting us. How do we have the capacity to cut through that to figure out what's real and what's fake? Yeah, I don't know. So it's interesting stuff. Where do we go from here?
Well, we had also taken a look at what is happening with free speech and freedom of speech in general right now. And there was this article that came out very recently, and it's about the two-tier theory, or the two-value theory. And it essentially states that there's high-value speech and there's low-value speech. And according to the laws that currently exist, the low value speech is basically illegal, defamation, and like just plain.
By the way,
someone.
which article is this that?
I think it's. Do you remember the? It's.
The article? No.
Who the author is? Anything?
It's his name is something. I think it's Deckenberg or something like that.
Say it again.
Deckenberg or something along those lines. That's
Okay.
yeah. I don't remember exactly.
Anyway,
Should
so
have written it down. But
yeah.
that came out recently, and he basically states that, or he defends low value speech. He says that there is value in low value speech, even when you're trying to just defame someone or threaten someone, or even trying to just plain insult someone in a discussion. It is actually of value because it riles people up, or it serves a purpose of trying to basically animate the person that you were trying to argue with. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it begs the question: who decides what's high value and what's low value?
Right.
So, we could talk about noise versus truth, but it's like, I don't really get the theory. I mean, when you sent me the outline of how we would proceed today, I looked up that two-tier. Then I just did a search on it, and it seemed like a bunch of garbage to me, frankly, because the information I was getting was inaccurate in terms of the law. It was suggesting that all sorts of speech, which is in fact protected, isn't protected.
And what kind of speech is that? If I don't
For example, hate speech, incitement to violence, defamation, defamatory speech. Now, these are all protected speech. You may have to pay a price if you engage in that speech because you're violating the rights of others, and there may be a remedy had against you. But that doesn't mean it's not protected speech. So far as I can ascertain, everything is protected under U.S. free speech jurisprudence. And if you want, we can then take a look at the differences between U.S. and European, standards of what is protected.
So you're saying that people infringing on other people's right is what gets them the punishment, not the fact that they say something.
Yeah, like John Stuart Mill's harm principle doesn't apply to speech.
I see.
The only speech under U.S. jurisprudence which is not allowed is speech that is intended to and likely to incite immediate violation of law, of lawlessness, and that includes violent acts, because violence is lawless. It's not allowed by law. You're assaulting somebody or battering them, and that's a violation of law. The only other thing that's not protected speech is obscenity, but that's laughable because we talked about in our class the fact that the definition of obscenity is a joke, because as the Supreme Court Justice infamously acknowledged when asked how do you define obscenity, when he said, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it, he exposed the hypocrisy of trying to say that obscene speech. So obscene speech would be lesser speech according to this two-tier theory, but let's be real. A lot of what throughout history has been called obscene is now seen as having great artistic or literary value. Right? Look at the books that have been banned in the past. Look at the artwork that's been banned in the past. So maybe lower level speech is like popular culture responding to societal warped speech. Maybe it's a stopgap effort of the public in order to fill in some gaps, to challenge conventional thinking. Because ultimately, if we believe in democracy, we believe that there's no elite or authority that has a lockhold on the truth. We believe in the protection of minority rights and interests in order to challenge and dissent the conventional thinking.
True.
And so, in that context, I would agree with what this person's suggesting, although I got a problem with some of the things I saw when I looked up this two-tier theory because it's inaccurate, I think.
Do you think it's becoming more true with the age of the internet, so that we have those bots now that essentially just give out this type of low-value speech, and that perhaps that there is a sort of discrepancy forming in the types of speech that you can put out on the internet?
Would you rephrase that for me, Friederike?
So basically, do you believe that there are two values in speech on the internet? So like there are bots, for example, who are basically just there to spam and basically try to, I don't know, form an opinion that maybe you wouldn't have had otherwise, or I don't know, these fake news articles that come out and stuff like that. If
I
that
hate
is
the term fake news, but go ahead.
I know, but like for lack of a better way to put it.
Yeah, right.
If that basically creates a type of two-value system on the internet, where you have the fake news that is basically the low-value speech, and the all the genuine news, which is going to the high-value speech. Do you think there could be some sort of distinction like that on the internet?
No, I think that there needs to be, and this is what Tim Wu refers to as weaponized speech, and traditional speech, and it all rests in truth value. It's like there's a couple ways to approach this. One is law, one is ethics, I think. And so, and I guess we could also talk about principles of informal logic in terms of understanding why it matters. So let's just start with the logic first. It's like, truth value. It's like the ability to be able to prove something true or false. And so it's like so much of the clickbait on the internet has no real information content. It's just sensationalized information in order to generate revenue.
Right.
It's not really asserting anything that's intended to be understood as having any evidentiary basis or truth behind. It's just shock value stuff. It's tabloid journalism on steroids, which again goes to the the commercial interests and the economy of the new media economy. And so it's like I think that like from the perspective of it's been a long week. Where were we? Just clue me back in a second so I can relate it to law and ethics.
We were talking about two-tier theory in the context of the internet.
Yeah, like low-level speech. Yeah, so it's like I guess I'll conclude with ethics because maybe it's the most important and the most interesting one. In terms of law, you can't really distinguish except through government regulation in terms of nudging people and providing incentives not to engage in speech that is not only of no societal value, of negative societal value, because it's intended to distort and confuse and misrepresent.
To say this, shouting fire in the crowded theater is a commonly used metaphor to describe the phenomena that you're sort of referring to. And do you think this is completely unlawful? Is there a consensus within the jurisprudence that this is clearly unlawful, and since it degrades truth? Because it's
what does shouting fire in a crowded theater have to do with degrading truth?
Because
there's either fire or there isn't.
Falsely.
Oh, right, yeah, okay. So like, it's like, I'm just gonna stick to the legal standard, okay? That is only not protected speech if there's a local law that prohibits endangering the public welfare. It would be a public nuisance, or there would be some law saying you're not allowed to alarm people. You can't be in a football stadium and do something that's gonna lead people to make as it happens oftentimes in football matches where people stampede stuff and people get trampled and stuff. It's an analogous thing. And so I think the conventional law addresses that because it should make such conduct illegal. I don't know. I mean, that's obviously the traditional example that's used in order to show that free speech has limits and it's not absolutely protected. But I think there's better examples we can use.
So what would you suggest as another example so that our audience can get a better picture of this?
You see, these things are all contextual. The big thing now is hate speech. People are very concerned about the protection of minority communities, gender, racial, nationally. We need to protect in terms of nations and ethnic communities against genocide. The international community says that's important. And you can look at the case of Rwanda where they were getting on the radio and stuff and telling one tribal group to kill the other, saying this is their duty to the motherland, okay? That, to me, is the greatest example of unprotected speech, because you're inciting people to immediately take violent action to take the lives of other people based on their condition of birth.
So inciting immediate violence, basically, is what you mentioned earlier. Sort of.
It's inciting immediate violence for no end other than political opportunism. There's no claim of self-defense here. There's no defense of the homeland stuff. There's no rationale for it. I don't know, I just want to not lose track of the problem with hate speech is under U.S. jurisprudence those things are consistently struck down as unconstitutional because it's I think it was Justice Holmes who said that if freedom of speech means anything at all, it means freedom for the thought that we hate, because it's easy to support free speech of those viewpoints you agree with, but if you really believe in free speech, you have to check it against that speech you find the most hateful.
I think Chomsky.
The Klan, the Nazis, whatever group that you find most hateful. And so this whole thing came up after Charlottesville, where David Cole, who was the legal director for the ACLU, was facing a lot of heat. And, he wrote this thing that I think I shared with you all from the New York Review of Books called Why We Must Still Defend Free Speech. And the interesting part of that the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, the defenders of the Bill of Rights in its most fundamental form, have to contend with is how gun culture impacts that. Because does somebody marching in a public place armed, expressing their hate, have the right to do that? Because the local law in many places allow you to carry firearms with you. But I would contend, no, that's clearly wrong, because what it does is it creates the likelihood of an imminent use of those weapons. And in fact, that's why we saw violence happening in Charlottesville. So these things become flashpoints for violent clashes to occur and people to be injured and killed, as in fact happened there. But hate speech is protected because if you believe in the marketplace of ideas, rationale, which we can critique at a lot of levels, then it's a content-based restriction. It's a viewpoint-based restriction. And to be clear, under current U.S. jurisprudence, somebody is allowed to speak inciting violent actions, inciting the overthrow of the government, so long as it's not likely to actually lead to imminent results of what it calls for. So it's all contextual. So, it's illegal to be across from, an African community center and have a Klan rally and get up on the pedestal with, people carrying torches and say, let's get these people out of our community. You know what you need to do it now. That's not protected speech. But to speak in the abstract, and there was a case, about a communist organizer in which the Supreme Court for the first time gave real meaning to the First Amendment, in which they said that the law by which he was imprisoned for speaking his support for the violent overthrow of the U.S. government was unconstitutional because it was content-based restriction, and he was presenting an abstract idea. He wasn't actually calling for it in a context in which it would likely lead to conduct. So it's the nexus between conduct and speech that matters, and that's why it all comes down to context. But I don't want to ignore, if I could just say one last thing in terms of where we're at here, in terms of the two-tier thing. This is where it gets really hard, where it comes to offensive speech and hate speech and stuff like that. It's high-value speech is speech where individuals act with responsibility. They think and they're thoughtful and deliberative before uttering their judgments or conclusions. They don't just speak out of passion or fury or emotion.
So basically adding to the value of truth that is existing in the community around, right?
Say it again, Naveen?
Adding to the value of truth that is existing in the community around you. That is when you think and you say something.
Yeah, it shows that you care about truth,
Yes,
that you're
yes.
being deliberative,
Mhm.
right? And like we haven't talked about Donald Trump yet, but it's clear that his whole manner of speech is anything but deliberative. It is intended to be incendiary, to spark people's passions, and so that's clearly low-level speech because there's no deliberation in it. But then you get to intention, okay? Because if this is the Kantian notion of something being moral, is you look to the intent of the actor, and that's always impossible to get inside somebody's head or heart. But if they reject the very notion of truth, and if they're just a hired gun or an agent, as in the case of trolls, then how can they be deemed to have any moral integrity in their speech? Now, under the law, that makes no difference. You don't have to be a moral speaker. You don't have to have integrity. But if we're to parse the different levels of speech, all these factors merit consideration. And the hard part is, well, what do you do about it? You guys got any ideas what to do about it?
Not really. Not really.
Well, I mean, with the internet, it's easier to regulate, but when it comes to actual real life, in-person speech, then it is a lot harder to regulate. And like you've mentioned a lot of times before, it's all about context, right? It's all about what you're trying to do, and there's no way we can read people's minds or really say who is really has the intent to just rile up the situation, or who has the intent to actually spread truth or to spread an idea, really. And because of that, because that's so hard, it's really hard looking into the future and seeing a community where you have free speech and at the same time you don't have people that will just put a gun in the air and say, whatever they want to say.
Yeah, I mean, let's just recognize that one of the ironies of the internet, I mean, maybe I want to give you the most radical proposal I can make in terms of how we improve the quality of speech on the internet and get your reaction to it. It could be the case that anytime anybody goes online, they have to give a thumbprint or have their iris scanned in order to document who it is that's online that's speaking in whatever form.
So taking away anonymity from
It's
people.
taking away anonymity and is making everybody accountable for their speech. Which, well, before I say any more about that, how does that proposal strike you?
I can't say much about it right now. Maybe following. See, the thing is, in the internet, on the internet today, most people are registered without any kind of ID or identification to make sure that it's them. And I don't think internet can be controlled in that way, anyways, because today it's controlled by corporations who want the job done easy. For example, Facebook, you need to fill about 3 boxes to join Facebook and post something online. So I don't think the corporate market is going to give in to this and remove anonymity anyways, because it's not controlled by the government as of now. Unless we make it controlled by the government, I think the corporate world will keep the anonymity part of it alive.
Well, let's delve that a little further. Couldn't it be in the interest of the corporate community to make everybody accountable? It would certainly make tracking more effective.
But the amount of noise that is generated in the internet will go down.
Yeah.
That
People like the anonymity.
Yes, and that will definitely affect the business of the corporations, which they will not be interested in. So today the internet is mostly controlled by corporations, and I don't see this happening.
Okay, let's go to utopia for a second. Let's forget corporate interests. Let's suppose that we could get this done if we wanted to. Would you be in favor of it?
That's quite politically.
Well, to be honest,
well done. I like that thoughtful face.
well, honestly, there's...
No, don't be honest. Tell me lies.
Well,
Cut that from your vocabulary, to be honest with you.
okay, got it. Okay, now I completely lost what I was going to say. But, okay, no, the anonymity gives way to contribution, right? So part of the wonders of the internet is that there is this anonymous platform where you can basically post anything. And I don't just mean that in the sense that you can just post threats and you can post all these low-value speech, right? But it's also in the sense that you can really contribute without feeling embarrassed for whatever ideas you have. So even if you are some sort of person who is, I don't know, in a country where there's war and the political regime is absolutely terrible, then having the internet and a place where you can anonymously post something that goes against that sort of regime, that sort of
absolutely.
place.
It's important for human rights activists.
Exactly. It's really valuable.
By the way, the word you just mentioned made me realize that I omitted something from the latest iteration of unprotected speech, and that's true threats. True threats don't have to be imminent, but if they're to be taken literally, that somebody feels that they're going to be, and this often comes down to like love gone bad and like broken, marriages and threats against former spouses and stuff. Well, that's not protected because it's something that to be taken seriously that puts somebody in real feelings of vulnerability and danger, and that's not protected specific threats. The definition of true threat is still problematic, but it's another unprotected area of speech. But it's like, I'm just going to play devil's advocate on this. I'll just say that and then I'll respond to this after you guys do, that if the problem with speech today, given the abundance of speech, is that it's mostly garbage and noise and weaponized speech intended to confuse and mislead, we could the reason why fake news is a stupid term to me is because fake news is a term that was developed in order to stifle debate. And in fact, what we're talking about is just a new label for propaganda, and a new form of propaganda because just another way of... See, when it comes to the marketplace of ideas, throughout history and forever into the future, as I can possibly foresee it, those with money and power will always seek to use those assets to shape the marketplace of information and ideas in their interest. Why wouldn't they? And so it's like, just be really skeptical of the term fake news because it's a useless and I think harmful term. But what were we talking about? I did it again.
You wanted to give us a radical opinion and then...
Okay. So the problem is that we got all this garbage speech out there.
Right.
We got a fix for it. Everybody has to have their iris scanned or give a thumbprint. Everybody, when they're online, is accountable. That will enhance the quality of speech online.
What about like...
All in favor, say aye.
I disagree. What about whistleblowers and things like
Exactly. Speak, Naveen.
So somebody wants to give out information that they don't want themselves to hold their name accountable for it, but they still want to give out the true information which will help all the people that surround them and who they want to give the information to. In this scenario, would you still think that they should use their fingerprint or iris scan to and give their identity and not give the news out?
Absolutely. WikiLeaks couldn't exist.
And I'd actually bring up another point because now there's this technology where you can basically face swap someone, right, and make them say and do things that they haven't actually done. So basically you put their head on another person's body. And it's gotten to a point where it's hard to tell.
Wow.
Yeah, it's hard to tell.
This is new to you? Well, okay.
Yeah, I'm a dinosaur. I guess I'm learn from you guys.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't surprise me. It's basically photoshopping, right?
Basically, but yeah, it's getting really hard to tell whether or not that was the actual person doing whatever act is being shown in the video. And so it's getting really hard to even control that sort of flow of information. So if you basically say that the president did this or that and basically just put his face on another person's body that was doing some sort of crazy thing, people will just scroll through their feeds, see that video and not really look at the source, but see, hey, the president actually did this, you see it on video and you think it's the truth. And I don't think that people would really go into seeing who it was. So even if you had the retina scan and the fingerprint, they won't really be held accountable.
Right. Let's recognize where we're at. Think back to the presidential debates when Donald Trump was hurling invective and stalking Hillary Clinton on the stage and saying things that were, demonstrably untrue. And Hillary Clinton just kept saying, go to the fact checker, people. People didn't bother to go to the fact checker because what they were more interested in was whether she had a spine to stand up to this guy or not.
Yeah.
and she showed herself as not having a spine, and so they said, I'm not going to support a woman who's going to just take this.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, there's a problem that we need to recognize. Where did it come from? Enlightenment values of the past hundreds of years have suggested that people care about science and truth.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, it seems like in a relatively short time we've veered very far from that. So it's like, do you guys have any thoughts on that?
I need to pick you up on that. See, when you said Hillary Clinton said go fact check him. Basically, she was giving them choices, or maybe even limiting people's choices of what to do next, right? And so, do you think limiting choices of people, or giving, I'm talking about reactance theory here, if you know what I'm talking about, for the
I
audience.
spent 30 seconds Googling that term last night after I learned it from your thing, and it has to do with basically behavioral stuff where
Yes.
people perceive that their choices are limited.
Yes,
And so it does seem very applicable to what social media, for example,
Yes.
and what algorithms, for example, have done to humans' perceptions of how they can define themselves online. Why don't you teach me a little bit
and this
about
is the
that?
thing that I was telling you about. Just for the audience to understand, in a plain, simple example, if I took Mr. Cohn to an ice cream shop and there were 50 ice creams in 50 flavors of ice creams in the ice cream shop, all right? And I tell you, you don't have any money. I tell you, I'm giving you 3 choices from these 50 choices. You can only, I'm going to buy a free ice cream for you, but I'm going to give you only 3 choices. So basically what I'm
You
doing
buy
is,
it for me,
yes,
and you're going to choose the 3.
only
that
3,
you
yes,
choose from.
out of all the 50. So
Yeah,
basically you came to the shop, you saw that you had 50 choices, and now I'm limiting those choices to just 3. And now, reactance theory basically says that you will sort of react to this and sort of conflict with this limitation of choices. And
I feel my freedom has been taken
yes,
away.
exactly. And my point was, do you think politically people could sort of restrict other people's choices and make them come to conclusions that they want them to come to?
It's already happened.
Exactly.
I mean, that's a moot question.
Exactly.
It's already happened in the commercial sphere, in the political sphere.
In the political sphere, do you think in the recent times also?
Was it?
Do you think in the political sphere in the recent times also this has happened?
Of course.
Mm-hmm.
It's the influence of money in politics. It's like, the old rhetorical question, what's the difference between a Democrat and a Republican? And that's why I go back to your question about leftist versus, because the scope of the debate has been made so narrow that the perspective that people have is warped, I would contend. I mean, it's really been the closing of the liberal mind. And the influence of media on this we could talk about, and influences upon the media we could talk about, and new media and its potential versus its reality we could talk about. But so why don't you teach me more about this? What's it called?
Reactance theory, yeah.
Yeah. It totally exists.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they use it in marketing quite a lot. So when you're trying to market a new product, for example, there's even real life implications in the sense that if you're in a narrower hallway, you'll try to basically broaden your choices. So if a market is introducing a new product, they'll try to do it in a very crowded mall because they'll think, oh, you know what, you have something new. That means you have a new choice that opened up, so they'll try to get that. And there's all kinds of other various applications in marketing that it applies to.
Thank you for teaching me the term.
You're welcome.
That fits the reality, right? That's what theory does. It helps to explain reality. Well done.
All right.
Exactly.
Just this one concluding question, and we'll come to a conclusion after that. So basically, during the Obama administration, the First Lady tried to lead a health campaign centered on nutrition education in schools. All right, this is still relating to the reactance theory, and this caused many parental organizations to accuse the federal government of being a nanny state, basically telling people what to do in of sorts. So basically, and accuse them of eugenic-like programs and wanting restricting the freedom of its citizens in terms of what they can eat.
Right.
So
I could share with you as a New Yorker, there was this huge uproar when, I think it was Mayor Bloomberg who wanted to ban the big gulp soda. It's really unhealthy. It makes people obese. And as soon as local government said we want to stop the local retailers from selling these fountain sodas that are the size of a bucket in the interest of public health, people went crazy.
Mhm.
So yeah, people's misplaced sense of their, freedom interests and stuff, and this is another example of it. Don't tell me to eat healthy food.
Mhm.
You don't tell me what to eat, nanny state.
Mhm.
So what about it?
So, like, how polarizing do you think, like, figures to form? How influential can reactants, as far as we've explained reactants to you, can be to polarize, like, political views and bring people to two different ends of the spectrum rather than to bring them to the center, if you understand what I mean.
Teaching people about reactive theory?
No, just reactants. As far as we've spoken to you about reactants, how do you think the the government is using, not the government, political parties are using this to take people to polarize views?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's talk about a war.
Mm-hmm.
I look at the influence of official voices on decisions of foreign policy, and I'm always amazed by, obviously you expect government to have an agenda. You don't expect the major media outlets to simply parrot that agenda by presenting things in the pro-war stance that they do, right? Liberal, leftist, people talk about the New York Times as being liberal and leftist.
Mm-hmm.
The New York Times has not yet seen a U.S. war initiative that they haven't endorsed. They're just like Hillary Clinton.
Mm-hmm.
They're hawks. They're establishment apparatus, institutions that are presented as being doves, as being not interested in a strong America. So it's like, this is the most consequential form of reactive theory I can think of. The tendency to support empire building and to support every war effort. So I don't care, man. If people, that's an individual thing. If you want to eat garbage food and you want to drink garbage soda, that's fine, but I really don't want to subsidize your healthcare costs.
Yes, absolutely. Because
But if you want to start killing innocent people at home and abroad because of this theory, then that's much more consequential, I would say, because it has greater externality costs than people just damaging their own physical well-being. And we could do a similar thing about like gun debate thing and how warped that has become. Amazing, huh?
Absolutely. So we are coming to a concluding note, Mr. Cohn. Next week.
Oh, I thought we were just getting started here.
No, we have exactly an hour to do this.
Yeah.
And so.
What's going on with the lighting? It's getting very moody.
Yeah.
Oh, this is happy hour lighting.
Yes.
And next week, exactly at the same time, exactly on the same day, at 5:15 p.m. Friday, we will be having a topic called Gender in the Workplace. And all of you are welcome to watch this, and we will be concluding on
Gender in the what?
in the workplace.
In the workplace.
Yes.
Excellent. I'll tune in. I'll be watching. You're going to send me the link, right?
Sure, perfect. Thank you so much. Have a
Thank
nice
you
day.
for organizing
And
this.
thank you for being here.
Pleasure.
you.